Hi, everyone. Welcome to a special Everything Bagel podcast. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Jodie. In April of 2020, we lost Robert Mezey. Bob was a poet, a critic, a translator, and a teacher, and he was my mentor for the better part of my adult life. Over the course of those years, Bob really grew to become a dear friend.
Jodie had the idea to pull together 3 or 4 people and use this platform to do a tribute to Bob. Well, quickly, 3 or 4 people grew to 26 interviews, over 20 hours of interview footage. I think she and I are both just humbled and heartened by the outpouring of support, not just for this project, but for Bob.
We decided to call this Struck by Lightning for Poetry. This came from Alice Quinn's interview. We felt that if anything summed up Bob's relationship to the craft, this was it.
Yeah, as someone who only met Bob a handful of times, I learned a lot from the stories and anecdotes shared here. And it was very clear that from age 13 through the rest of his life, that poetry really meant the world to Bob. And Bob meant a lot to the world of poetry.
You know, I think when we started this, we weren't sure what we were going to get. But my God, we were really delighted with what you're about to hear.
I mentioned 26 interviews. Those are done over the phone, Skype, Zoom, different countries. Some people were inside talking to us. Some people were outside. You'll hear birds chirping. So the audio quality varies. So we also chose Debussy's Violin Sonata in G minor for the music. We felt that was fitting.
I just want to say a really special thank you to everyone that took the time to be part of this. This really meant a lot to me, and I know it would have meant a lot to Bob. And gosh, I only wish he could have heard it.
With that, here's Struck by Lightning for Poetry, a tribute to Robert Mezey.
My name is Rhina Espaillat. I got to know Bob through literary events, but of course I knew his work before I knew him, and I was glad to meet him. And he was delightful. He was delightful company. We had long conversations about poetry. Sometimes not even conversations, just reciting, remembering from memory the work of this one or that one or the other one, and stories about different people and so on. So it was just wonderful company and very easy to like. He had a rough crust, as many people remember, but it was very thin. It was a thin crust that pretended to be hard. But all you had to do was get him conversing about something he really cared about. And if he felt that you were listening, that you were willing to listen, he warmed up immediately. It was immediate. The crust was gone. And he was modest, and he was simple about admitting his frailty. I've been rereading his Collected, which I have here right next to me. And I am reminded every time I take it off the shelf what a wonderful poet he was, how human he was, how unfussy, how unpretentious, how unlikely to put on a mask of any kind. I think another thing that hurt him no end was finding it impossible to publish those magnificent translations of Jorge Luis Borges. That broke his heart. Nobody else has done them this way. He made them sound as if they had been written in English. They're really phenomenal. And he was loose with them. Nothing in those translations seems tight or tied up. Well, I'd like to say that his poetry is going to be good and readable and understandable forever, because he touches something human that not everybody manages to. I think he's going to remain, no matter how much the language changes, there is something about his work that sounds like human speech at its most easygoing, at its most intimate. And they say love is easy as the turning of a page. Haven't you heard that, honey? Like the turning of a page? But they mumble something different in the back rooms of old age. I'm not a first-time loser. I've been down this road before, and once again I find myself standing outside a door. But even as I spell it out, I still don't know the score. Yet the truth is plain as day, love. All you need to do is look. I can see it clear as daylight, saw it in your parting look. Love is a sudden emptiness, like the closing of a book. You forget how good simple human conversation can be if it has a little music added to it. And he knew how to do that. So thank you for doing this. I'm very grateful to you for including me.
Hi, is this Charles?
Yeah, is this Jodie?
Yes, this is.
Hi. Well, I had in mind telling you that I had known about him since 1961 when I first went to Iowa. I didn't meet him. He'd taken off for Palo Alto to go to Stanford, from which he left and then went to Mexico with Mary Sims, who then became his wife. She came back to Iowa City the next year. I guess that'd be 1962. But Bob didn't come, so I still hadn't met Bob, although he was famous around town because he just won the Lamont thing. That was a big deal. I eventually met Mary. I don't know how, or probably some party. And we hooked up for the next 3 years. And that was my bond with Bob, was through Mary, because we both liked her, even after they were divorced. So that was our main talking point. I think I saw him once in Fresno when he was escorting Ginsburg around. And I guess Ginsburg had come to read. I don't know what I was doing up there. I did see him once in Pomona, or Claremont, or wherever it was, when he and Ollie were together. My wife and I went over there. And I think that's the only time I've seen him since before he started coming down to meet Ollie here in Charlottesville, and we'd have lunch over the last 4 or 5 years. I'd read all his stuff, thought he's a terrific poet. I did go to one reading he gave over in Ollie's town, over in Nelson County. There were about 4 or 5 people. It was really embarrassing, but Bob read so well. He was reading translation. But it was a wonderful reading, even though there wasn't anybody there. Then I talked to him on the phone from time to time. He'd call up about 9 o'clock at night. We'd discuss our various ills. And the thing I remember most about the telephone was when we were in Claremont and had a padlock on it. So Ollie couldn't get on and talk. Oh, yeah, but she's a wonderful girl.
You said that you enjoyed hearing some of his readings. Do you have a favorite poem of his, or?
Well, I liked everything I read, basically, but I don't have one particular favorite, although that thing about his mother is pretty funny.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites as well.
And my mother, a comedian to the bone. Well, where did you know him, Jodie? Where'd you go to school?
Well, I met him when I was 16 years old. I was actually on a tour of colleges, and I didn't know who Bob was. I went over to Pomona, and I just walked into his office with some silly poems I'd written in high school and said, "Hello, my name is Jodie Hollander, and I would like to be a poet, and here are my poems." And I was very fortunate that Bob liked what I had written, because this could have gone sour very quickly.
Yeah.
But he was really, really kind with me. And, I was only a sophomore in high school. And even before I came to Pomona, he started sending me poems in the mail to read. He was sending me his translations of Borges. He was sending me Thomas Hardy, Robinson Frost, and he put me on a metrical poetry diet right out of the gate.
Well, that's good. He was actually a very nice guy.
I think a lot of people didn't get to know the real Bob because of his gruff exterior, but he had a very kind heart.
I liked Bob, and I thought he was a very smart guy. And then one time I remember I told my wife he has more poetry in his head than most people do in books.
I heard stories of parties where people would say, "Hey, Bob, would you recite this Yeats poem or this Frost poem?" And then they couldn't get him to stop.
Yeah. Well, okay, you be well.
Okay, thank you, Charles. You too.
You bet, Jodie. Take care.
My mother. My mother writes from Trenton, a comedian to the bone, but underneath serious and all heart. "Honey," she says, "be a mensch and marry too. It's no good to worry. You were doing the best you can. Your dad and everyone thinks you turned out very well. As long as you pay your bills, nobody can say a word. You can tell them to drop dead. So save $1, it can't hurt. Remember Frank you went to high school with? He still lives with his wife's mother. His wife works while he writes his books, and did he ever sell a one? The 4 kids run around naked, 36, and he's never had, you'll excuse my expression, even a pot to piss in or a window to throw it. Such a smart boy, he couldn't read the footprints on the wall. Honey, you think you know all the answers? You don't. Please, try to put some money away. Believe me, it wouldn't hurt. Artist, schmartist, life's too short for that kind of, forgive me, horseshit. I know what you want better than you. All that counts is to make a good living and the best of everything, as Sholem Aleichem said. Did you ever read his books, dear? You should make what he makes a year. Anyway, he says someplace, poverty is no disgrace, but it's no honor either. That's what I say. Love, Mother.
I'm Dana Gioia. The thing that I think is most remarkable about Bob was how independent his taste was. You see it in his poetry, you see it in his criticism, and you see it in his editing. He did, several books that strike me as, absolutely perfect, in what they attempted to do. One of which was Naked Poetry, the first edition of Naked Poetry. And if you don't believe how important, Bob's vision was, just look at the second edition, which was done mostly by Stephen Berg, with so much of what made the first book important vanishes, and it simply becomes a more tiresome, factional book. When people have asked me what they should read by Bob, first of all, it's going to be hard for them to get his poetry. His poetry is, I think is pretty much entirely out of print at this point. What I do is I say, get his edition of Thomas Hardy or his edition of E.A. Robinson and read the introductory essays, which embody, I think, everything that is invaluable about the perspective of the poet critic versus the academic critic. These are both pieces of brilliant insight and passionate advocacy written at a level of emotional communication in which the ideas are not only demonstrated but are felt in the piece. That gift was very rare in Bob's generation. Bob Mezey, when he chose to write his pieces, which primarily took the form of introductions to books and occasionally a few other things, he writes at the absolutely highest level. There's a kind of display of literary intelligence. And you see this too. What else of Bob's is so fine? His translations are, in some cases, nearly perfect. Bob had that kind of elastic imagination which allowed him to do this. Certainly another reason why Bob is not as well known as he should be was that his masterpiece of translation, which are his versions of Jorge Luis Borges, which he did with Dick Barnes, were never published. And they exist in a kind of copy shop version that, he passed out to a couple of friends. Now, Bob's poetic journey began as the typical transformation of a poet in his generation, which is to say, he began as a formal poet and then just at the very start of middle age turned into a free verse poet. What makes him, I think, interesting is that as, towards the end of middle age, he shifted back to be a formal poet again. And so you have a journey which in 3 parts. The first part is he immerses himself and masters the tradition. The second part is he breaks from that into what is frankly a second tradition, because it wasn't as if that was the typical generational move at that time. But then what makes him independent is that at a point where most people had locked into their style, Bob went back to formal meters, which I think, he handled with a kind of greater transparency and immediacy in the third part of his career. But if you think about this too, he helped perform 2 great tasks of literary resurrection. One was co-editing with Donald Justice the poems of Henri Coulette, which would not have happened otherwise. And it's a perfect edition, lovingly presented. And the other is bringing out Weldon Keys's work in Naked Poetry, whom Stephen Berg dropped from the second edition. It's really quite true in my generation. Everyone who discovered Keys discovered it through Naked Poetry. But I think they would have been lost because Don, who had exquisite taste too, was, I'm not sure, you must have seen this side of Bob, his quarrelsome side. But he and Don got along really beautifully. And I mention this because something quite rare in literary life is the ability to collaborate. Certainly one of Bob's very best poems is the Ballad of Charlie Starkweather, which he wrote collaboratively with Don Justice, and in fact wrote a lost melody. You see, when they composed it, Bob had a guitar. They composed it together as a song, and it is a perfect ballad. I mean, just mordant, wicked. Bob's virtues are so salient. He was brilliant, quick, funny, inventive, energetic, virile in the tough little guy way. Those are all wonderful attributes. Among the poets that I've known well, Bob Mezey was one of the smartest, funniest, and most human. I miss him.
Hello.
Hi, Jackie. This is Jodie Hollander. Are you ready to talk for a few minutes about Bob?
Sure. My name is Jacqueline Coulette. Most people call me Jackie or Jack. I first met Bob in Iowa City, Iowa. My husband and I had been there for, I guess, a couple of years when Bob and his wife arrived. He was 19 years old, just out of the service. They lived across the street from us in an apartment building on one corner, and we were across the street on another corner in an apartment building. My husband, Henry Coulette, and some of the other fellows in the poetry workshop sort of took Bob under their wings because he was younger. He was still an undergraduate where they were all graduate students. So that was how we met. He had a beautiful young wife who was a Southern girl. They had a baby, Eve, who probably was the most beautiful baby I have ever seen. Bob was a great football fan, as my husband and I were.
Bob was a football fan?
Oh, yes, indeed.
I did not know that side of him. He talked about tennis with me, but I never knew about the football.
Yes, he was a great football fan. And the three of us went to many games together. And, of course, Iowa City is, Big Ten football, so what could be better? But no matter what the weather was, if there was ice on the seats, we were there.
Did you hear him read poetry?
Yes, I did. What was interesting, however, was that Bob had the photographic memory, and my husband was not very good about remembering his own poems to recite them in public. There were a few times when I think there were ruffled feathers, let's say, when Hank would start reciting one of his own poems and forget it, and Bob would finish the poem for him.
Gosh.
And I know that happened certainly more than once. Bob and I, in the Iowa years, I think he thought I was terribly square, and I thought he was, a little bit too far out. But it's interesting how in later years, Henry died in 1988, and Bob and I became very close friends after that. It's interesting how our friendship really picked up after Hank died. And I think with age, we both mellowed. Of course, I thought of Bob as a kid, because he was 6 years younger than I and 8 years younger than my husband. So he did seem like a kid, even though he was already married. I think that our backgrounds, the three of us, Bob, my husband, and my background, were very similar in the fact that the three of us grew up poor. But I think it was different. Bob's growing up in Philadelphia, and we always got such a kick out of his accent and the way he talked about a flick. And that was a term that we never, ever used about a film. And he was, of course, wild about Marlon Brando. Oh, yeah, he loved Marlon Brando. So let me just mention one little crazy thing. We predicted by the age of 40 that Bob would have had 5 wives.
I love it.
And he only made it to 3. Well, I don't know. It's interesting. It's been a lot of years. I love Bob, and his going is a loss. Is a real loss. He was I guess I might call him the last of the Mohicans, of that group of poets. It was an extraordinary group. Well, thank you so much for including me.
It's absolutely my pleasure, Jackie. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, take care, Jackie.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
My name is Michael Collier, and I can remember very clearly when I first learned of Robert Mezey. It was fall of 1971, and I started to read his poems, and they were nothing like the the picture I saw, which was a kind of lesson about poetry, I think. The selection in Naked Poetry, as I began to read through the anthology and saw that he and Stephen Berg, they were the youngest poets in the book. And as I started to read the other poets, especially someone like James Wright, I began to see how, Mezey was learning from those poets. And that was kind of exciting for me. I didn't know they were called, part of what they were doing was working with the deep image. I didn't know that that's what it was then. In the first poem in that anthology called Touch It, you can see how he's been influenced by Wright and Bly and Merwin. And I thought that was really interesting. I was intuiting something about how we learn as poets from somebody else and how we incorporate aspects of their work into our own. And that poem, Touch It, I do go back to. And one of the reasons I go back to it also is because it's still very formal. It's not rhyming, but it's fairly good iambic because he's still working out of that formal training that all of the poets he was with at Iowa with were still doing. When I was in graduate school at the University of Arizona from 77 to 1979, my teachers there, Mark Halpern, John Anderson, and Steve Orland, who had all been together at Iowa, they did have a handful of poems by Bob that they really liked. So I did read some of those poems. And of course, the very famous one, My Mother, which I think, people really like it because, well, first of all, there aren't that many parents who are so keen about you becoming a poet. So you identify with that aspect. And then you have a mother who says horse shit, and that's not so usual either. But then there's also this kind of shticky, jokey aspect to the poem as well. The book that Wesleyan did in 1987, and I read that book and was really taken by it and realized that I had kind of missed somebody. And probably just because he really did disappear in a way for a while. Or you could say he was overshadowed or undershadowed or something. But because he became a committed formalist, there wasn't much space for that. Though I do just want to say that this, has nothing to do necessarily with the poetry. My last image of him was at Joe Osterhaus's wedding. It was a beautiful summer afternoon, and I just remember he seemed really calm, and he was really enjoying himself. That's how I remember him.
Tea Dance at the Nautilus Hotel after a watercolor by Donald Justice. The gleam of eyes under the striped umbrellas, we see them still after so many years, or think we do. The young men and their dears bandying forward glances as through masks in the curled bluish haze of panatellas, and taking nips from little silver flasks. They sit at tables as the sun is going, bent over cigarettes and lukewarm tea, talking small talk, gossip, and gallantry. Some of them single, some husbands and wives, laughing and telling stories, all unknowing they sit here in the heyday of their lives. And some then dance off in the late sunlight, lips brushing cheeks, hands growing warm in hands, feet gliding at the lightest of commands, all summer on their caught or sighing breath as they whirl on toward the oncoming night, and nothing further from their thoughts than death. But they danced here 65 years ago, Almost all of them must be underground. Who could be left to smile at the sound of the old fangled dance tunes and each pair of youthful lovers swaying to and fro? Only a dreamer who was never there.
I'm Olivia Ellis, and I first met Bob when I was a freshman at Fresno State. It was summertime, and he was teaching a Hardy and Yates class. And he was famous for Hardy and Yates classes because he wept thoroughly through all of them. And so the people who became writers used to like to take that class, interestingly enough. But I had two classes that summer. I had advanced diving first, and then I had Bob's class. So here this drowned rat would make her way to Bob Mezey's Hardy and Yates class. And I would open the door and walk in, and there was no way I could get from the gym to there on time. So I was always a couple minutes late, and the door would open, and here I would be soaking wet, my hair stringy against my face, starving, and he would be reading and weeping. And he tried to pretend that everything was perfectly normal, but somehow he noticed me. So that was Hardy and Yates was where I first met him. And it was an incredible experience because he felt everything the writer was feeling. And, you know, Pisces are very spiritual people anyway, and they have this ability to feel what other people are feeling and be very empathetic toward them. It was natural, but it was an extraordinarily powerful experience. Everybody loved that class. Everybody said, you have to take this class. It's amazing. But Bob had a way of bringing his own mercies into every line of poetry he read. You know, his melodic walking with the poet. You were breathing in not only what the poet had written and was feeling, but Bob amplified it with his own deep, you know, inner knowing. I told him once, you must have the best ear in the English language. He said, no, Donald Justice is still alive. You know, and there was never a time he wasn't writing, even when he was doing all of the other kinds of publishing. He stayed faithful to his ear. He just was wide open. His whole heart and soul was wide open, you know, and he wanted justice. His big thing in life was justice, and he tried to get justice for the earth. He tried to get justice for his students. And it was often misinterpreted, like, you know, people in the outside of the colleges would have no idea really what this kind of person was like because he wasn't a capitalist. For years and years, he would not buy a home because he said, how can you buy a piece of Mother Earth? And so we always rented because he thought it was tremendously disrespectful of the earth to say that's your property.
Ollie, could we move to talking about Virginia Hamilton Adair, to Bob's friendship with her, how he met her and how they worked together?
Sure. That was a wonderful relationship because they both had a good sense of humor. And so Virginia wasn't hurt by anything that might or might not be said. So they had a wonderful rapport and that neither was ever offended by the other. And Bob was 100% taken by her poetry and totally astonished that she wasn't published and out there. And he thought, you know, she's this long life, you know, she should already have a book. He was determined that he help her get published. And so he spent evening after evening with her, year after year, and wrote so many letters on her behalf and encouraged her in every conceivable way. It was astonishing. It was like when Dick and he were translating Neruda. It's as if Neruda came to live with them in a way, you know, would follow them each home, talk to them. But with Virginia there, it was more of a playful kind of endearment. She would always greet him with the hugest smile and just so much love in her being for him. And of course, he loved her the same way. here's a kindred spirit, here's a poet. He took complete charge of it because she had no way to correct or edit her stuff, being blind. And so he did everything for her, every single thing, took every phone call until Alice Quinn came out there at the very end to meet her. He had spent years doing that. It was really a lesson in unconditional love, which he's easily capable of. Okay, very good. Thank you, Jodie.
Okay, thanks. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Hi, Eugene.
I am here.
Hi.
I'm Eugene Pugach. Well, I was an undergraduate at Kenyon College in 1951. I had a room in West Wing of Old Kenyon, which was a famous dormitory, and James Wright was living in the same dormitory, and we invited James to my room and found Robert Mezey accompanying James. And what is interesting, Bob kind of had a scowling face, and James Wright referred to him as Ludwig van Mezey. That it was a typical undergraduate event where we drank wine and recited poetry, and then one of the things that Robert enjoyed was the Kenyon theater group had a production of St. Joan by George Bernard Shaw, and Mezey played the part, I think, of the Bishop of Beaulieu in St. Joan. I don't know whether Bob was very happy at Kenyon's in that freshman year. He studied with Professor Fink, who was a classics Latin professor at Kenyon. Fink was famous for flunking Henry Ford II out of Yale or something like that. Another thing which reminds me of Bob was that I spent a vacation in Philadelphia with Lefevre. Bob was in the Army at that time, and I remember meeting him when Bob had leave. There was a Jewish delicatessen, and we had bagels and corned beef sandwiches and things like that. I recall him with his Army boots on, very polished Army boots. And I don't know whether he had a happy time in the Army. I think that I remember best, although I am a doctor and a neurologist, I'm very much enamored with contemporary poetry, and he was a wonderful contemporary poet and who inspired me from discussions of poetry. He was always very exciting and never boring at all. When he was at his top form, he was undoubtedly a fierce person. Ludwig van Mezey and the fierceness of Beethoven were appropriate descriptions of him. And I remember him as a truly loving friend and a loyal friend, and I very much miss him. Okay, all the best, Miss Hollander.
Thanks, Eugene. Have a good one.
You too. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Okay, I'm Charles Martin, and I first actually came to know Bob's wife before I knew Bob. I was about 21 or 22. This was back in the mid-1960s. I was a graduate student at Buffalo. I was there during the summer session, and Galway Cannell and Bob Mezey were both teaching courses then. And I signed up for Galway's course because I think probably just because of he was talking about long modernist poems. So I signed up for Galway's course rather than Bob's, and I don't remember now what Bob was teaching. But Bob's wife, Ollie, was in Galway's course, and she was about 9.5 months pregnant. I guess they were having their first baby almost imminently. So I guess I met Ollie and Naomi before I met Bob. I think at that time he was moving away from the formal kind of work he had been doing in the Lovemaker, and he was exploring free verse. And I was more interested in the possibilities of formal stuff. And when Bob came out with the Naked Poetry anthology, I thought, oh, well, there's another one gone, lost to the cause. And I had a copy of Bob's anthology because I had read the early poems and liked them. Yeah, but I knew Bob's poetry and liked it, and I sort of kept track of him over the years. And then I actually met him, I think, at one of the Westchester conferences, and we started talking, and we fell into a nice, warm sort of relationship. But it always struck me when I got his collected poems and could see the range of his work. It really didn't make much difference whether he was writing formal poetry or free poetry. The work was always, very good. It was always Bob, there was his personality was behind it. But I always thought that, he was one of those poets who did his best work maybe at the end. There are those two sonnets, the Hardy sonnet and the sonnet after Hopper, both just, they're in the permanent anthology as far as I'm concerned, and they were both late poems. He is a poet of considerable depth and a great deal of range as well. And we've been ignoring in our conversation the really funny poems, the Clara Hughes and those Tailgaters, which I thought were a really marvelous invention. The ones where he would take a line from a famous poem, I celebrate myself and sing myself, and then he'd add another line and kiss my pictures on the shelf. And a wonderful kind of range. Well, he will definitely be missed.
I'm Paul St. Amour. I am a professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania. And for the first 10 years that I was teaching after graduate school, I taught in the English department at Pomona College, where I was really fortunate to be the colleague of Bob Mezey. He was a kind of unlooked-for blessing on those early years for me. One of the things we had in common was a love of Thomas Hardy. And at that time, I had never read any of Hardy's poetry. I only knew the novels. And I taught Jude the Obscure. It's really thanks to Bob that I got to know Hardy's poetry. I would love to read a poem of Bob's just called Hardy that appears in his collected poems, but also in an introduction he wrote to a volume of Hardy's poetry. It's a sonnet about Hardy's birth. And the story in Hardy's family was that he was stillborn and everyone had given up on him, but the midwife, who kept whacking away at him until he revived. But what Bob does in this poem is to take what you expect to be a kind of joyful story about a kind of near-miss encounter with death and recovery that happens sort of at the last possible moment. And he transvalues it into a kind of tragedy. So I'll read Hardy. Thrown away at birth, he was recovered, plucked from the swaddling shroud, and chafed and slapped, the crone implacable. At last he shivered, drew the first breath, and howled, and lay there, trapped in a world from which there is but one escape, and that forestalled now almost 90 years. In such a scene as he himself might shape, the maker of 1,000 songs appears. From this it follows, all the ironies life plays on one whose fate it is to follow the way of things, the suffering one sees, the many cups of bitterness he must swallow before he is permitted to be gone where he was headed in that early dawn. I remember Bob reading this poem aloud at readings he gave on campus, and you'll remember this, Jodie, the way he often was so moved by the poems he was reading or reciting that he would weep. And he was well known for doing this in his classes. And I think it was sort of astonishing for students to see this, very eminent poet reduced to tears by poems that he knew so intimately after having taught them for decades. I think this one made an impression on me because it's one thing to weep at another poet's work that has shaped you and moves you and maybe partly inspired you to become a poet. I think there's something else at work when you weep at your own work. And if poetry that you write really is just a thing that you already know, and that is just a distillation of yourself, it could never surprise you enough to evoke strong emotion. And I think that the fact that a person can weep at their own poem is sort of testament that poetry is something that we don't know. That the poem you write is actually a distillation of a thing you didn't know that you knew, and that remains strange to you, even if if it's on a subject or about an experience that you've been meditating on for a long time. And it was as if Bob was sort of ambushed by the things that his poems knew that maybe he didn't know or that he had forgotten. With Dick Barnes, their friendship made a huge impression on me. I didn't know many people at the ends of their academic careers, and I certainly wasn't really privy to intimate friendships between people that age. And these were two people who had collaborated very closely on a translation of Borges's poems, which then I think was never published because of problems with the estate. Their friendship was founded in, I think, a lot of joy and shared appreciation, but also in this kind of stymied project and a kind of grief over the fact that all of this labor was not able to be shared finally. And I remember they're talking very movingly about really their grief at the fact that this was never going to see the light of day, at least not probably during their lifetimes. But they were also, just deeply devoted to each other. And when Dick was sick with cancer, Bob was always there at the house, visiting him. And after Dick's death, Bob really was a champion of his work, which he felt had never been recognized commensurately with its qualities. Toward the last few years that I was in Claremont, that's what I remember most vividly about Bob, was his role as a kind of vigil keeper by his poetic legacy. And, to have seen the friendship between the two of them when they were both alive, and then to see how faithful and how devoted Bob was to the memory and to the work of his friend, left a very deep impression on me that's still quite vivid.
My name is Terese Coe. I first met Bob Mezey at the Rhina Museum in New York the night his collected won the 2002 Poets Prize. He was utterly elated, just over the moon, as they say. Later, we had a correspondence. He acted as a mentor to me for a few years. We were emailing back and forth. By then, I had started to translate and publish Borges, and he gave me some excellent advice about that. Thanks to his own and at times very discouraging experience with his Borges work. Both Bob and Richard Wilbur told me that it's acceptable to publish a number of translations for which you don't hold the copyright on the original. But Bob gave me more detail. He said it was inadvisable to publish a whole book of translations that way, and not to include the original foreign language poem. We did trade some Borges translations, and I sent him other translations as well. But the wonderful thing was we had no competitiveness about it. He was doing it his way, and I was doing it a somewhat different way. Now, he was more interested in having very regular IP, and I decided I would not do entirely IP and not entirely do rhyme, but some rhyme. In a 2014 email, he wrote me about his collected poems. Quote, I did call the section of translation glosses and variation, claiming in the foreword that translations as such did not really exist. In any case, I wouldn't worry about it. You might use the phrase after Borges at the bottom of each version. End quote. Among other things, I told him I admired his ingenuity and boldness about doing those translations, as well as many of his poems and translations, and told him how much it meant to me that he gave me this advice. I would use the term variations, as he suggested, to describe my Borges efforts as well. I also said I agreed with Galway Cannell's comment on the hypertext.com about Mezey's poems, and that it was so true and precise. He had, Cannell had, quote, the effort to bring into words that ultimate tenderness toward existence, which is the dream of great poems, unquote. He had said that about Mezey's work. That was one of Bob's great strengths, his tenderness toward existence. In a return email in 2014, Bob also wrote, I wish I were still writing and translating, but for the last couple of years I've been quite overwhelmed by what they call fatigue syndrome, and between the utter lack of energy and the degeneration of my memory. Writing days are behind me, but I'm still trying to put a couple of books together of stuff already written, unquote. Also, in 2015, he wrote to me that he'd had an emergency, and it took him 3.5 hours to mail something. When I asked him what it was, he said, just a computer emergency. I wish I'd never bought one of the damn things. But the same thing happens with my phone and the credit card machines in stores, etc., etc., not to mention contemporary culture and the human race in general. He acted as one of my references for a 2015 Guggenheim grant, and I was totally chuffed that he agreed to exchange books with me. He sent me his collected, and I sent him my shot silk. And now I can miss him now that he's gone, but at least I have his books.
My name is Rosanna Warren, and I didn't know Bob Mezey well, but we corresponded about poetry for, I think it must be 10 or 15 years, these recent years. I came to know him first by inviting him to talk about his translations of Borges at the translation seminar at Boston University, which I ran for about 25 years. Those translations that he did with Richard Barnes, and which were never able to be published as a book because of complications with Wright, but was a marvelous translation. I had been reading Bob's poetry for years before I met him. Of course, I knew the famous anthology, Naked Poetry, and I had been fascinated by this poet who had straddled the stupid ideological division in American poetry in the 60s and 70s between free verse and metrical verse, and he was able to have intelligent sympathy and mastery in both. Anyway, so it was just a great delight to meet him in person. And clearly one felt a deep heart. One felt in the presence of a real mind. It was just a serious, intense, courteous, a kind of depth of being there, and not somebody who displayed himself in any ostentatious way. He was the absolute opposite of a literary operator. There's a poem that he wrote to Philip Levine on the Day of Atonement, which shows a lot of his complicated gifts, because on the one hand, it's very witty. It's parodying Milton's Samson Agonistes. And so, Jewless in Gaza, says Mezey to his fellow Jew, Phil Levine. But it's a very serious poem at the same time about being Jewish in a Gentile world. And I remember these lines, but still keep some dark essential difference. That elegance, that was him writing in elegant sort of John Ransom meters, witty, and also elementally serious and treating of a subject with all kinds of complicated pain in it. But maybe it's sort of rare for someone to have the kind of capacious sympathies that he had poetically. He was not doctrinaire. He was not dogmatic. He had a beautiful openness aesthetically to different kinds of poems, different kinds of ways poems could be good. And that seems to me important to hold on to as a virtue. Well, I think he lived very much in poetry and for poetry, as well as for his family and friendships. And he needed to feel that the poetry was alive in him. And it was. And I was tremendously sad to lose him. He was a totally individual spirit and soul and kind of writer. So I feel a real gap there, a real loss. And I'm so moved that you and your husband are doing this. It's beautiful that you're doing it, and important to remember. And in a time when people are confused and angry and frightened, it just seems all the more important to remember the enduring achievement of Bob.
Hi, my name is Mike Juster. I think that in many ways, he didn't get his due. I gather that in some ways, he was his own worst enemy sometimes with people. I gather that, he's very charismatic and very intense and would bond with people, but often would have trouble sustaining those relationships. And so I have a sense, and this may be unfair, but I have talked to others that have had the same sense, that, in these days where I think self-promotion in order to get recognition is much more important than it was when Bob started, that, the fact that that didn't really play to his skill set has really kept him down. I think he wrote some wonderful, wonderful work, and I don't think even in the new formalist community, which is a pretty small fragment, the overall poetry community, I don't think he's as well known and as frequently read, as he ought to be. Because, he grew up, he won the Le Mans 60 years ago or something like that. And in those days, you won that, and people paid attention, and you were kind of made. There was a lot you would do, and you would get invitations to do things, and you'd get published in the major journals and that kind of thing. And it just doesn't work that way anymore. It's a very different publishing culture. I've seen a lot of the Borges translation, and I have friends that own the Forbid collection. I run with a lot of translators, and it's kind of our nightmare to spend a big chunk of your career translating someone and then not be able to publish it. Now, sometimes that's because, it isn't good enough or people aren't interested. But those weren't factors with Bob. Bob's translations were terrific, and people, around the world are still fascinated by Borges. The fact that Bob thought that he had permission to do this and spent so much of his time doing it and then did it so well and then couldn't publish it. It broke the heart of translators around. And the fact that you could only access these superb translations in Samizdat fashion. I don't know, some people may not know what Samizdat. In the old Soviet Union, you'd have literature that was forbidden by the state that then would somehow get passed, often in handwritten copies, from one person to another, and they became often very cherished literary artifacts. And so, these Samizdat copies of Bob's translations became very cherished items, and it sort of added to that, mystique that there was kind of this tragedy. And then maybe for people that know him a little bit better, the use tragic is a little bit more apt than, for the colloquial use of the term, because, maybe his own flaws brought this on in some way. I don't know. I've heard conflicting stories as to what happened and who did what and that kind of thing. And so I don't claim to know. But as a story, you don't have a lot of comparable ones in recent years. I guess the one thing I would say as a translator is there are a lot of poets that do a lot of translating of a lot of poets, and sometimes the work is terrible, and sometimes it's fine, and sometimes it's quite good. It's relatively rare where you get the sense that the translator and the poet are just exquisitely well matched. And I think it's a little bit more complicated with Bob and Borges. But I think despite his formal training, because I know, he studied under, Ransom, Winters, and Justice, so, a pretty big league formalist group. But he went through sort of a wilder stage in the 60s, as many younger people were doing at the time. And so, I think that for all that formal orientation, there was something that connected with him in the 60s, and a little bit of the wildness, a little bit of the surreality, and that type of thing. And Borges is very formal as well. There is that sort of sense, kind of it's sort of like a pre-magic realism in Borges' work that I think that Bob just had a knack for, and I think in part was he just lived through a time and brought it into his work. And I think there's a reason why other translators have had difficulty living up to the standard that Bob set, because Bob had that kind of special connection to the work. I think in his original poetry, he had remarkable concision. He could put an awful lot into a very small number of words, which is something that, is a skill that I don't think is valued very much anymore, but I value it. He had, for all that formal orientation, there was something that connected with him in the 60s, and a little bit of the wildness, a little bit of the surreality. And, although Borges is very formal as well, there is that sort of sense, kind of it's sort of like a pre-magic realism in Borges' work that I think that Bob just had a knack for. And I think in part was he just lived through a time that was in certain ways very Borgesian and brought it into his work. And I think there's a reason why other translators have had difficulty living up to the standard that Bob set, because Bob had that kind of special connection to the work.
My name is Alice Quinn. Bob was so purely devoted to poetry. He really was devoted to the craft, devoted to the tradition. He came to some classes of mine at Recited Hardy and John Crow Ransom and Henri Coulette, whom he always championed, and Frost and other favorites of his, flooded with feeling, his eyes brimming with tears. Afterwards we would go and meet Annie Wright and Jane Cooper. There was a dive on Amsterdam Avenue that they liked. Honestly, I felt that all of them, just being together, they could have pea soup and a glass of water because it was such an elixir for them to dip into their memories and 50s and the 60s and that heyday of poetry. So I saw Bob when I began my work at the Poetry Society as the director. I started going out to Los Angeles again, and I saw Bob. I would take a drive to Claremont, and we would meet at his favorite bookstore and have lunch. I forget the name of that wonderful bookstore, but I spent a great deal of money with Bob in that bookstore. And to me, Bob was struck by lightning through poetry. It was with him all of his life. It was the strongest first thing in every encounter with him was what he was reading, what he was thinking about, a poem he was working on, a form that he was entranced by. And also it was part, Jodie, of his tremendous attraction for women. It wasn't just that Bob loved women. Women loved Bob. I think that's another thing, that Bob always stayed in touch with his exes, which is a great sign, I think, of marriage that is anchored in friendship, too, and respect. It's just like his work on the Borges project. Pretty early on, we talked about it, and it seemed vexed. The whole Wright situation seemed incredibly vexed. And, I said, you might not really be able to publish these. And he just took that in stride. They were just having fun doing it. And I'm sure that it's in amongst his papers. They translated about 300 poems. That's why he was so smart. He knew that labor would not be in vain, that as long as they put them in a box, someday somebody would recognize their quality. And it was an experience of thrilling artistic collaboration. I thought Bob was really a mighty spiritual force for poetry. Anyway, he was a very bold spirit, and I'll always be I'll just always treasure the time I spent with him.
Hello.
Hi, Jan. This is Jodie.
Hi, Jodie. I've expected your call.
Oh, good.
Okay. Well, I'm Jan Schreiber. I am a poet and translator and writer and teacher of poetry. I first encountered Bob, if you will, back in the 1960s when a book that he co-edited with Stephen Berg called Naked Poetry was published. And that's where I first ran into Bob's work, and I thought he was rather clever to have put a poem that had a lot of formal elements of his own in a book that was supposed to be about free-form poems. Mezey writes with an attention to sound and form, and were obviously written by a poet with a very good ear. Much of his life, he was a voice crying in the wilderness.
Well, and that's really why we wanted to do this, was to sort of give his voice some permanence in some way.
Well, I'm interested, Jodie, about his approach to Borges, because he wasn't really doing a translation of Borges's poem. And I don't think Bob was trying to do a strict translation of Borges. In fact, he deviated very significantly from him, but he was writing his own poem based on something that Borges had said. There is a way in which a poet translator can simply use a text as an inspiration and a jumping off point to do something rather different. I'm particularly taken with these two poems. One of them is called N.W., that's the one that's based on Borges, and one is called Evening Wind, based on a Hopper etching. But I'm interested in them because of what they say about Bob's own mind and the changes he made to Borges and the imagination that he generated from the Hopper etching.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Bob has said to me that he thinks Evening Wind is one of his best poems. It's such a beautiful piece.
It is beautiful, and, part of it really depends on his imagining or thinking his way into the presumed mind of the woman depicted in the etching. So that sums up what I respond to in Bob, to his ability to take somebody's work and make something new and completely interesting in a new way out of it. Okay, well, listen, best of luck to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jan.
Jodie, well, stay in touch.
You too.
Okay, bye.
Evening Wind, after an etching by Edward Hopper. 1 foot on the floor, 1 knee in bed, bent forward on both hands, as if to leap into a heaven of silken cloud or keep an old appointment. Tryst, one almost said. Some promise, some entanglement that led in broad daylight to privacy and sleep, to dreams of love, the rapture of the deep. Oh, everything that must be left unsaid. Why then does she suddenly look aside at a white window full of empty space and curtains swaying inward? Does she sense in darkening air the vast indifference that enters in and will not be denied, to breathe unseen upon her nakedness?
Well, my name is Michael Shepler, and I came to know Robert Mezey in the spring of 1968. There was going to be a poetry festival, which I think it was the first one that year at UC Irvine. I was driving a Comet station wagon at the time with a cunnilingus bumper sticker on the back of it. So my initial meeting with Bob was he was quite amused because he got stuck behind me on the freeway going down there, and he was amazed and amused by my bumper stickers. Basically, I began reading his stuff after that and being very taken with it. I mean, it fell right in with what I was thinking and doing and writing at the time. One of the things that was nice was that he was always very good about his criticism of my work and very supportive of it. Then when it came time for him to edit the Poems of the American West for Everyman, he was very nice in that he wanted me to submit some stuff for them, which I did, and which they published. So it was enormously gratifying to have that collection come out, and be in company of all those people, my mentor, Henry, and Bob, and Larry Levis, and Phil Levine, and, more poets that I can name that somehow touched on, poetry in California and in the American West. So I wanted to mention what an influence that Naked Poetry, the anthology that Bob and Stephen Berg put together in 1970 had on my work and on a lot of other people's work. I mean, it was an amazing collection. Yeah, I think it was interesting in the sense that, like so many people of my age, we started off with reading On the Road and Ginsberg, and there was that whole thing about first thought, best thought, that, was promoted, and that was perfect, for, some teenager in a high school somewhere that, was just bursting with hormones, and he had all this stuff that he wanted to get out. And so that's what we did. We took those guys up and we ran with that whole thing about, yeah, man, we're free, we're cool and you're not. And I only preface that in saying that Naked Poetry, it was pulling us away from the new criticism in a way that was not just, like the Beats did. And it was a much more measured approach, I think, to freeing up writers. I think that book, along with Down at the Santa Fe Depot, 20 Fresno poet. Bob's got his ankh on in the picture, around his neck, and he's got his wild beard, and in the other picture he's got his sandals on and everything, and talking about, fighting the man and everything else. It's very funny to read it, but the poems are so good, and the poems in Naked Poetry are so good, and I think that there's room for all of it. I felt very sad to hear it because, in a way, he's kind of the last of the big guns in my world. There's only 7 years difference in our age, so I mean, he was kind of an older brother in a sense, I guess. But it's very sad, and I miss them all. But we've always got the writing.
My name is Annie Wright. I was married to the poet James Wright, and that's how I got to know Bob, because James and Bob were classmates at Kenyon College. Bob was only 16 when he went to Kenyon, brilliant and a poet. And I heard many more things about him long before I met him. Bob went through many changes in his life. A little bit I found out about Bob, some comments that he made. He did not have a very happy childhood. His parents were not supportive of him in his intellectual pursuits or his writing. They just weren't interested in that sort of thing. He could be very argumentative. I'm sure you've heard that before. He was invited to be a guest speaker at the James Wright Poetry Festival in Martins Ferry, Ohio. And some of his remarks caused annoyance to a whole audience full of people who were there to talk about poetry. He seemed oblivious of it, but he sort of softened as he got older. I say, for me, he sort of kept his eye out for me after James died, so he became a really good friend. It was a pleasure to talk about my beloved friend.
Hi, my name is Saundra Rose Maley, and I've known Bob Mezey since November of 1989. Throughout our 30-year friendship, he would mention James Wright just about every time we got together. He said to me, he went to Central High, I believe in Philadelphia, and graduated like top of his class and graduated early. And he ended up going to Kenyon College. But he said he was walking down what they called Middle Path on campus. And this fellow comes up, big guy, and he says to him, "You the new kid? You the new poet?" And Bob kind of looked at him scared to death. And he said, "I guess so, yeah." And immediately he said James Wright started reciting Thomas Hardy's poem, Lisby Brown. And Bob said he looked at him amazed. And then he just walked away after, and he just looked at me. He ran home, Bob said, and he found Hardy's poem and he memorized it. And he had a love affair from then on with Thomas Hardy and James Wright. That he really loved him, even though there was quite a distance, in their age. But they became fast friends. Many of my students didn't even speak English very well. They're from all over the place at Montgomery College, and it's a community college. But they loved him. I mean, they could not believe how he memorized these poems. I remember one time he must have recited 5 or 6 Frost poems one after the other. And they were, because they can't remember a couple of lines, and he was just doing these whole poems, and they just sat there with their mouths open. So that was fun, and he was good with them. And you couldn't help but feel, yourself love poetry. He just loved it so much. It was like contagious to hear him talk about it. And it was miraculous. I tried, every time he came to town, I tried to get it, and he loved to talk about the poetry in front of the class. So I tried to get him there almost every time he came to town. And I'm going to miss him. I already miss him because we were supposed to, matter of fact, just when all this pandemic business started, we were going to have lunch that week. And then they closed everything down and said, well, no, don't come. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had a great conversation. I said, Bob, when this is all over, I'll come together, come over and we'll go to lunch again. He kept the classical meters and the forms in mind as he then went off on his free verse when he did that. And he was good whichever he did, whether he was going freely or with more structure. I don't know of anybody who does it as well as he did, but he could do it. I mean, it was like breathing to him, and he was such a good man.
My name is Jonathan Blunk, and I wrote the biography of
James Wright called A Life in Poetry. You know, the thing that I always think of first when I think of Bob Mezey is the generosity he showed me immediately when I was doing my research. He took an enormous care and concern over my work, and I felt really supported by him. And he was enormously generous to me when I think once he vetted me in terms of my seriousness about the project. It was immediately apparent to me what a huge, huge impact that James Wright had on Bob Mezey throughout his life. I think it was a real formative relationship for him. I just wanted to read a short passage from the biography, which kind of sets the scene of their first meeting. Soon after classes began, Wright learned that a new poet had arrived on campus, a 16-year-old freshman by the name of Robert Mezey. Wright set out immediately to meet him, and now I'm quoting Bob Mezey. I was at Kenyon maybe the second or third day I was there, scared to death, and I was approached on Middle Path by this big, burly character dressed completely in army fatigues. He must have been about 8 years older than I was at the time, but it might as well have been 30. I mean, he was a man, and I was a boy. And he came up to me, and he said, "You're a poet, kid. Listen to this." And he launched into Hardy's lovely poem, To Liz B. Brown, which, of course, he had by heart, and which seemed to me one of the most beautiful things I had ever heard. That was the beginning of my 30-year friendship with Jim and my lifelong passion for Thomas Hardy. And Bob says, and I already knew some of Hardy's poetry, and I liked it. I'd read 2 or 3 novels in high school, but I'd never heard anything so beautiful in my whole life, I thought. That was the beginning of my lifelong love of Hardy. When I did this selected poems of Thomas Hardy that came out earlier this year, so that would have been 1999, I had a number of reasons for doing it, but foremost among them certainly was a sort of homage to Jim, because I know that he would have loved that book, and that if he had lived, he would have probably done it himself and done it better. So, you know, the marvelous work that Bob Mezey does in rhyme and meter is really superlative. I mean, some of his sonnets, I think, are absolutely heartbreaking in the same way that say E.A. Robinson's. He was a master of the sonnet. And so all of the work and study that Bob Mezey did, you can feel that rich earth that yields his own poems. So I'm pretty much in awe of Bob Mezey's poems that touch upon that devotion to the art and his command of form. It's really quite remarkable. You know, I have to smile when I think of Bob Mezey, because there was a kind of gruffness to his demeanor that quickly dissipated as soon as the talk went to poetry. And certainly when we started speaking about James Wright, all of that roughness kind of fell away, and it was quickly taken up in a celebration. There was something about Robert Mezey that knew who the great poets were and how the work got done. And there was a seriousness about him and his devotion to the craft that could not help but impress you if you spend any time in his company.
Okay, so this is Jane Shore, and I was a student at Goddard College, and my teacher at the time, Barry Goldenson, gave me The Lovemaker and White Blossoms to read, because he was a poet too. And I just fell in love with Bob Mezey's poems. I'd never read anything like them before. I loved the classical formal quality of them, and also because they were mischievous in their own way as well. And so those are the early poems that I knew, and I loved them so much. First fell in love with his poetry, and I really mean fell in love, like memorized fell in love. I have taught his poems since that time, and we're now talking about 2020, so it means every group of students I've ever had since 1973 have read those poems by him. And they love them too. So that's one story I have about him. The second story, and this is about me, I was at the Radcliffe Institute, and I was sitting in on Elizabeth Bishop's poetry workshop, and this had to be 1971. She asked the class to memorize a poem and then recite it in class. And so, since I was such a huge fan of Robert Mezey, I memorized Touch It. But, so I recited it. And when I came to the line, I am told that what we love most is dying. After I was done with the poem, she wanted to talk about that line. And because she was so precise in everything too, and she said, I don't know how I feel about that because the line seems so ambiguous. Does it mean that I am told that I love dying the most, or I am told that the things we love the most are dying? And she was not thrilled with the ambiguity of that. Whereas I still think that's like one of the great lines ever written. But what I particularly love is the ending of that poem because it becomes totally participating. The person who reads it suddenly is in the picture and is commanded at the end of the poem to touch what that thing is that we love most. I still love that poem, and I don't care what Elizabeth Bishop said. I love her, but I just don't care. I think she was wrong. Touch It. Out on the bare gray roads, I pass by vineyards withering toward winter, cold magenta shapes and green fingers, the leaves rippling in the early darkness. Past the thinning orchard, the fields are on fire. A mountain of smoke climbs the desolate wind, and at its root fire is eating dead grass with many small teeth. When I get home, the evening sun has narrowed to a filament. When it goes, and the dark falls like a hand on a tabletop, I am told that what we love most is dying. The coldness of it is even on this page at the edge of your fingernail. Touch it. I didn't know him. I wasn't one of his friends, but I was one of his biggest fans forever. So I was very sad to hear that he died. I think that things that you love from the time you're first starting to write are not always the things you love 50 years later. But in this case, I still love them. And I love them even more because I understand them even more. There's not much you can do in life, but I think art is endurable. And even if the whole world doesn't know who you are, he really touched my life. And I think the lives of my students, too, which has been a lot of students. It's a great loss. And I hope that everybody will enjoy him as much as we all have.
Well, my name is Bill Broder. I am a prose writer, not a poet. From the very beginning, we were close to Bob, and he was a loyal, gentle friend from the very beginning. We knew him in his fiery youth. Well, Bob was a man of immense enthusiasm. When he adopted a stance, it became almost fanatical. He had been this incredible prodigy. From a very young age, he was really a man able to create poems and had this incredible memory. I don't know if you ever heard the story of Bob meeting of Seamus Heaney in a pub in Western Ireland, and they started to trade poems that they knew in their head. And that started in the early evening, and it went on till dawn. Neither of them had a moment where they didn't remember a poem fully. Bob was one of the best readers of poetry. He read aloud better than most poets. And I've imagined that evening or that night with these two remarkable men of memory and love of poetry. Bob had a great love of not just his own poetry. When Bob gave a reading, he often read more of other people's poems than his own poems. They would come to his mind, and he didn't have to read it. It came out of his head. He had incredible memory. Wonderful.
My name is Bruce Bond, and I was an undergraduate at Pomona College when Bob arrived. He did something that's remarkably difficult. He would write formal poems without syntactical ornament, without a lot of qualifying phrases and so forth. And if you've tried that, you find it's a hell of a lot harder to write a formal poem with a kind of a bare, straightforward syntax. Yeah, Robert represents a very peculiar and very strong aesthetic that privileged both sort of the rigor of free verse and the rigor of form. And so he had very high standards. I never experienced his curmudgeon side. I know a lot of my friends did, but the Robert I knew was very, very supportive and very kind. And I know that he grew somewhat disillusioned later in life about the poetry world. They brought in Robert. And Robert, you know this already, he didn't have a traditional education. You know, he kept dropping out here or there or dropping in, just, hi, here I am. He kind of had the audacity of a Robert Lowell in a way. He was sort of a prodigy. When he was at Iowa, other people thought, this is the rising star. This is the guy who's going to be huge. As someone who was a quote-unquote non-academic, he was pretty sharp in terms of looking at academic writing, but he had a great bullshit meter. If something seemed willfully obscure, or just obscure, I should say, he would just say, I don't get this. It's obscure. For all I know, it's nonsense. He didn't like Olson's famous essay, Projective Verse. He just thought, it's too impossible to understand. I can't understand it. So more about Robert. He was a poet of great loyalties, I would say. He absolutely adored Donald Justice, and I think they must have talked on the phone at least every week. I think he had found his true compatriot there. It was through Donald, I believe, that Robert found the poetry of Weldon Keys. Weldon Keys was in that Naked Poetry. That was huge. I don't know that Weldon Keys would be known at all if it weren't for that book and the friendship between Donald Justice and Robert Mezey. One thing about Bob that I loved is how he would find these relatively obscure poets and tout them. So that's how I discovered the work of Henry Coulette, who was the Los Angeles poet. Things have gotten complicated, and I wonder sometimes if Robert's reputation has not thrived in part because he represents, in some people's imagination, a very quote-unquote conservative approach. Sometimes people conflate formalism with other modes of conservatism. I'm not even sure that formalism is, strictly speaking, what I would call conservative. At any rate, that's the way the political poetic imagination often operates these days. There's some phenomenal, like Vietnam era poems. You can see poems that have more evidence of his life as a Jew. In fact, I remember there was one, I've kind of ripped off this image of the sun as a yard-side candle. Many, many years later, when I published my first book, which was just a chapbook, I sent it to him, and he wrote me a letter back, and he liked the poems, and he invited me to come out and read, and I was nobody, and that meant a lot to me, and Robert was kind of a hero.
The silence. How many times God will remember the silence of the beginning? That silence which even God himself couldn't endure, which was finally to blame for our being here now. He lost his head and, clawing at the earth, picked up some mud and made us. And thus ended the silence, and then began the howling, interrupted now and then by a faint twittering when we make love in our sleep.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, Jodie. I'm Suzanne Lummis, and I knew about Bob long before I met him. When I got to Fresno State, he was legendary, beloved and notorious. He had just gotten fired from Fresno State. Everyone was furious about it, up in arms, because he had stated somewhere that he felt marijuana should be legalized. Shocking, right? So I have a poem of his. This poem is about as good as contemporary poetry gets. It is a consummate work of perfection, and it is called A Glimpse of Bojack. Bob had captured and described the love of boxing and how beautifully he described what was honorable, what was glorious. In fact, he is the only poet who ever lived who had a poem in the website called Frisco Boxing. And it had one poem on it, along with all the boxing information and history and everything, and that was by Robert Mezey. And I told Bob that, and he was so happy. I said, Bob, you know the boxers love your poem. Now, how many poets out there can say that? None of them. A Glimpse of Bojack. Philadelphia, 1946, night. My father and I are walking home along a pavement raked by swirling snowflakes wherever the wind kicks up. Having just emerged from under the beamed shadows of the L, we cross to the arena, heading home to mashed potatoes, sisters, downcast eyes, anger, and sullen silence, past the wall in which a door stands open, and I see in luminous blackness hundreds of black shapes, heads and shoulders, the sides of faces silvered in swirls of smoke, the embers of scars glowing an instant and then blacking out. Far off in the black depths, the source of light, the canvas square of rings circled by cleats, and a slim brown man who is a bigger man pinned on the ropes, digging blood-red gloves methodically, like a man chopping wood into his ribs, the white skin splotching pink. Could I have seen at that distance the rocking and ripple of muscle under the bronze skin, or did I just imagine all of this? It couldn't have been much more than a second. My father was a very impatient man, but there it is, as radiant as just now. My arm was jerked hard. I was dragged away, wondering desperately who the man was. Then there he was on a poster, fists cocked, poised, smiling behind his gloves. I have forgotten the name of his opponent, but not his name. I loved him, and I wanted what he had, not the jeweled belt, the title, money, fame. What could they mean to an 11-year-old? No. I wanted the pride and power, prowess and speed and grace, and even more, fearlessness in the face of bigger men. And that most beautiful of names, Bojack.
Suzanne, you read that so beautifully.
Well, it's easy to read well because it is suffused with feeling and absolutely honest emotion. Not that many people can do that well. Not a false move. Well, he must be one of the last living people, I suppose, to visit Ezra Pound in St. Elizabeth. I don't know who's left now who did. He was only about 15 at the time, and he had fallen in love with poetry. Imagine that. 15-year-old kid already knew that he was a poet, already knew he was destined to give his life to poetry. And the story he had about Pound was that at that time, everybody was making pilgrimages to see the great, the person who ushered in modernism. So all these literary people, poets, were making pilgrimages to him, but also sometimes many beginning poets, intermediate poets, or poets hoping to be published, and they would bring him their poetry. And he did not want to read all this stuff. Don't blame him. So he had over in the corner this semi-catatonic member of the resident of the asylum, who was Bob, I think, described as in a state of drooling, actually. And he would take the poems and he would say, "This is my literary manager over there." And I always let him read everything first. And then I would go over to that person who was, I guess, not do much with the pages that he was given. And that was his dark joke. But then there's a second part of this that's even better. His mother learned that he was visiting this old poet in St. Elizabeth's, which she thought was a hospital. And she got very worried and upset about this because she did not want her son to be a poet. So she wrote to Ezra Pound, beseeching him to convince her son not to be a poet. And Pound sent back a postcard, very courteous, very lovely. And Bob said that the postcard had long disappeared, but it said something like, "Don't worry, Mrs. Mezey, poetry is an honorable profession, and you should be proud that your son wants to be a poet," or something like that. So, not like most kids today. I'll see you a little later then.
Okay, take care.
Well, it's D.H. Fairchild, but everybody calls me Pete. I was a freshman at the University of Kansas in 1960, and when I went to buy my books that first semester, there was an anthology, famous at the time. I think it was called New Poets of England and America, and so I was interested, looked at it, and there was a poet in there I had not heard of, Mezey, and he was the youngest poet in that anthology, and he was only 7 years older than I was, and I was very impressed by that, and so I kept that name in my head, and I would look for his poems wherever I could. But I didn't meet him until decades later when I moved to Claremont, California, because that's where my teaching job took me. But actually, we never really got to know each other, never really started having long conversations about poetry till about 15 to 20 years ago, maybe. I wish I had known Bob before I did, because his direction in terms of poetics had taken a really sharp turn to the right. He almost disavowed poetry that he had written before that change of mind. I mean, he became, in his attitude, a very, very rigid formalist. And I wish I had known him before that. But we, nevertheless, we became really very good friends. But it just seemed like, especially I would say over the last 10 years, he just became darker about things. And it was, it was hard. It began to become hard to talk about any kind of contemporary poetry with him, because he just liked less and less and less of it. I would like to have known him earlier, especially because he's very wise about poetry. And in his earlier days, he was very smart about subjects that a lot of people and a lot of poets even don't know a lot about, and that is prosody. And I have a strong interest in prosody. And so it would have been great to have talked to him in those days. Plus, he had just a phenomenal memory for poetry. I mean, even when more recently I knew him well, it could be great fun sometimes, because he could just quote one poem after another. And I loved it when he would reminisce, for instance, about days when he was a good a really close friend of James Wright, and he says that Wright would visit him, and and of course they would sit around and drink quite a bit. But he said they would share poetry that they knew from memory. He said they would go all night, start out at 10 o'clock at night, and still be quoting poems to each other at 4 in the morning. He did say, though, that even though almost everybody who knew Bob thought he just had the most unbelievable number of poems memorized, he said that he always said that James Wright, though, had more than he did. It was always lovely to talk with Bob about poems he really loved. But I never forgot a single moment when I was with him, that at one time he was right at the center of American poetry. In fact, at least from the time that he appeared in that anthology of new poets of England and America, he was looked upon as the next big thing in American poetry. His life touched many, many poets and many, many very good poets. He's had a lot of students like yourself who have gone on to do quite well in the poetry world. So one of my main thoughts is I wish we could have a really large sort of appreciation for him by way of a lot of different people reading some of his poems. I also like to see a book of his poems come out that goes beyond simply the collected poem. There's an emotional tinge to that because I'm really going to miss the guy. I'm going to miss him a lot.
So my name is Maurya Simon, and I studied American poetry and formal poetics or prosody. I think I took 3 classes from Bob Mezey when I was an undergraduate. He was teaching at Pomona College, and I was a Pitzer College student. Those were probably the most important years of my life as a poet. At that time, Bob hadn't yet refuted the primacy of free verse, and instead he really embraced a broad spectrum of traditional verse modes and contemporary poetry. I remember in one class we read Ginsberg's Howl as well as Shakespeare's sonnets, so that gives you a sense of how eclectic and open his tastes were at that time. He really instilled in me a great love for poetry written in earlier forms and meters, especially the English and Italian sonnets, lyrical poems by Thomas Hardy, the blank verse poem by Robert Frost. And Bob had assigned to all his students to write Sestina's, Villanelle's, the Malayan-inspired Pantoum, Dante's Terza Rima stanzas. So I think he gave me such a great toolbox by forcing me to write in form, which is something I hadn't done before and I didn't know anything about before I met him. So I do feel endlessly blessed to have learned prosody from such a master. So I knew Bob in 1978. I continued knowing him for the next 4 decades, more than 4 decades of my writing life. And when he was in Claremont, before he returned back east, and we would meet every month, once a month, and talk about poetry and politics and his family and his earlier life. And it was really, for me, a time of getting to know him no longer as in the professor-student relationship, but as another adult, and to have a kind of closeness and intimacy as friends that I hadn't had before. So it was quite wonderful. And so I think what I'm trying to say in a roundabout way is that Bob was the truest and fiercest of friends, and that he nurtured these wonderful lifelong alliances with other poets and writers like Peter Eberwein and Larry Levis and Henry Coulette and Don Justice and Richard Barnes, Dick Barnes, and he would do everything he possibly could to advance their writing. Oh, I think one thing I should mention is that Bob passed away on Saturday, April 25th, and I finished editing on that day. I finished editing an interview that I had conducted with him back in 1987, and I had there were only 2 copies of the interview. It was an 8-hour-long interview. It was quite long. It was done over 4 days, and a mutual friend of ours, Chick Goldsmith, mentioned that he had been to the Huntington Library, he had visited the Robert Mezey archive, and he had seen our interview. And I said, "What interview?" And he said, "Oh, it says 1987 on it." And I remember I had forgotten about it. So I contacted the Huntington archivist, and she digitized, it was an audio, so it was a reel-to-reel audio tape recording, and Bob, back in 87, had given it to his academic secretary at Pomona College, and she had transcribed it on a Selectric typewriter, and then made a like a Xerox copy of it, copied it, and I got one copy, which I lost, and the other went to, when Bob moved back east to Maryland, he donated to his archive at the Huntington. So I got this in the mail, I think it was in the end of November of 2019, and I worked on it on and off, and then as I realized Bob was getting more frail, more tired, more world-weary, and I thought, I really need to get this thing done and get it to him. Well, I finished it a week ago Saturday, and then an hour after I finished it, I got the email from Naomi that he had died. Just the most uncanny, strange feeling, because I felt like I had been in conversation with him all day long. So I asked him at one point in the interview, I said to him, well, what do you believe in? Here's his answer. So what do I believe? One of the most beautiful lines I have ever come across is a remark by Danish physicist Niels Bohr that John Berryman quotes to me in one of his in one of his poems. He says this wonderful thing, that the opposite of the truth is a falsehood, but the opposite of a profound truth is another profound truth. If I believe anything, I believe that. So it makes it hard to say or to produce a credo exactly. Maybe that's why I write poems, to try to bring together at the moment of writing and contemplating just what it is that I'm experiencing, remembering, feeling in as much complexity that I can get into language. And I think I love that better than anything, trying to do it and seeing it done by the real masters. Because one of the things that poetry does is it creates reality. It adds to reality. It enlarges it.
My name's Jodie Hollander. I'm a teacher and a poet, and I studied with Bob for really the majority of my adult life. So to imagine a life in poetry without Bob is really strange for me. This is new and really difficult. I first came to know Bob when I was just 16 years old. I was a sophomore in high school visiting colleges. I was at the tennis courts, and I mentioned to the coach that I wanted to be a poet, and she said, oh, well, you better go over to Bob Mezey's office then. There were thousands of books in his office, and he had a way about him that was certainly intimidating, but also respectful. I remember sitting very quietly as he looked through my poems and just hoping that he was going to like what I had written. But I remember walking out of there feeling really excited that here was an acclaimed poet that was actually interested in taking me seriously as a writer. And I was just a teenager. I didn't know what I was doing. I remember I was teaching at a private school in Monterey, and I'd not been writing for many years at this point. And I saw a flyer saying that Bob Mezey was coming to read at Monterey Peninsula College. And I think there had been a gap of 6 years or so in between the time that we had been in touch. I went to hear him read, and I remember hearing him read Tea Dance at the Nautilus Hotel, and it was amazing. And I waited till the reading ended, and almost as if it were like a movie, he took his glasses off and looked at me. You know, he sort of had a way of getting right into whatever your truth was with his gaze, and asked me if I had been writing. And my answer was, no, I hadn't been writing. And he just kind of quietly shook his head, and he said, well, you should be. I loved his answering machine message. I have to admit that in the last few years, there were times that I called him when I knew he wasn't home, just to hear his answering machine, to hear his voice move beautifully through those lines about not being home or maybe only blotto. Well, I loved how our friendship developed over the years. Bob was, in a way, like an adopted father to me. There was always a sense that he was looking out for my well-being. And I felt the same way about him. And I started to really feel quite strongly that he needed to be recognized more than he was. And part of that was his own fault, because he did shoot himself in the foot a little bit with his sharp tongue. But part of it wasn't his fault. Part of it was his style of writing, and he didn't self-promote. And so his work remained unknown to a lot of people. So it felt really important to me that his work get out there, because as far as I was concerned, this is the standard for a living poet. And his taste in poetry was just exquisite. Of course, Bob introduced me, not personally, but to the work of Donald Justice and of course, Henry Coulette. Really, anyone that Bob recommended was always good. Whenever I think of poetry, I think of Bob, because Bob was really sort of the first real interaction I ever had with poetry. And he watched the evolution of my own work in a kind and supportive way. I think that a lot of people maybe didn't get to know the real Bob simply because he did have that crust about him and that gruffness in his personality. And it wasn't that hard to get past it as long as you were genuine and sincere, and you probably needed to care at least a little bit about poetry to get past that. But there was a truly warm, deep, loyal, wonderful human being in there that cared very much for friends and family, and of course cared more than anything for poetry.
I'm asleep, or maybe only blotto. I'm reading books or out running around. In any case, I'm incommunicado. This newfangled device will hold your sound until I get home or in the mood to hear it. So talk to me. I'm listening in spirit.
I'm Dave Mason, and when Bob's collected poems came out in about 2000, I was on the committee that awarded him the Poets Prize, and I'm really delighted by that and proud of that. And it seems to me that that's one of the few really substantial notes of recognition he had later in life. You know, he began his career something of a lightning flash, you know, winning the Lamont Prize and all that stuff. A bright young poet, seen as such by the likes of John Crowe Ransom and Ivor Winters and all sorts of other substantial figures in American literature. Sometime after that, Bob came out to Colorado, and he gave a reading at the Air Force Academy, and I had him down to Colorado College, and I was able to see him for a few days and get to know him better. And it was kind of wonderful. I think I was probably a little bit afraid, having heard that he could be curmudgeonly, and I found him absolutely congenial, really warm, really kind. That's the thing I'm really remembering about conversations with Bob. A kind of humility before the art, a really beautiful humility before the art. And I admired him for it. I liked him very much for it. When he came into his own was really when he returned to formal verse, where it seems to me the most substantial influence on him is not somebody like Donald Justice or Richard Wilbur, but really somebody going further back like Hardy or Robinson. There's a strong sense of the tight textures of those forms. He's a terrific sonnet writer. The sonnets are very Robinsonian in their textures and sounds. And there are kind of three areas where I think Bob was extraordinary and ought to be remembered. One is as a poet himself, and a poet who tried his hand at a lot of different things in the course of a long career. The other is as an editor and as an appreciator of other poets, a generous person who saw to it that other people's work got into print. And third is as a teacher. And there, Jodie, you have more experience of him. I've seen him in conversation, but that's a substantial contribution to American letters. So when I researched Edwin Arlington Robinson, I began to look at several editions of Robinson's work. And Robert Mezey's edition of a selected poems of Edwin Arlington Robinson is the best introduction to that poet anybody ever did. It is a terrific book. And his taste in a selection of Robinson's poems was as impeccable as anybody's. Same thing with his edition of Thomas Hardy. There are lots of editions of Thomas Hardy, but Bob's is really good. It's really substantial. And I can't imagine a better way to be introduced to Thomas Hardy's poetry. Going to Mezey's introduction is just terrific. It's a great way to go. So he published a bunch of formal poetry in the New Yorker in the last, well, in the first decade of this century. There's a poem called Fishing Around, which is about writing sonnets. But it has a typical Bob Mezey kind of whimsy. He calls the poem a lovely thing, but much too small to keep, as if he's deprecating his own work, as if he's placing his own work in relation to the great canon and saying, doesn't quite measure up. And that strikes me as being part of his stance. There's a sense of himself as an artist in relation to the really great artists of the past, and a sense of the awe at what they accomplished. In the last 20 years, he would periodically send me manuscripts of new work, and I was always full of admiration for them, and it always struck me as being very painful and very strange that there was no way he could publish this stuff, that this was stuck in a kind of limbo. And I don't understand what's at work in that. He was out of fashion. But the point is, what he represents in poetry transcends fashion. That's what he believed in. That's what he honored and loved himself. And so we need to pay attention to what happens to really substantial figures like Robert Mezey when they fall out of favor with the powers that be. And so I think of him as a profoundly honorable man, and a man with a beautiful humility, a good sense of humor, and a lovely way of honoring the great past.